By late summer, the excitement had long since worn off. We were all on autopilot, just waiting to go home. 10 months in country, and the days dragged on. The AO, area of operations, had calmed down so much that we stopped pulling guard shifts as teams. The goal was to give everyone some downtime, but for me, that downtime was a double-edged sword. I'd welcome the break, but when the nights got lonely, that's when the demons crept in. No distractions meant my mind started to wander. I'd replay decisions, beat myself up over mistakes. Doors I thought were closed would violently swing back open in my mind. I'd relive close calls and wonder why I made it out without a scratch. A small, irrational part of me felt guilty about that. Some of the best soldiers, better men than me, didn't make it, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It didn't make sense. Was it luck? Fate? God? I wasn't sure. I was just some idiot who stumbled through it all, but somehow walked away unscathed. Then there was Buford. He hit a pressure plate on a road and never got the chance to recover. Where was the justice in that? The ID he triggered was set off by a pressure plate, while the one we triggered weeks later was command detonated. That's just how it worked. No rhyme or reason. And sometimes when I replayed those moments, things seemed worse. Like when Kazinia took a bullet that could have ended him instead of just grazing his helmet. Those vivid daydreams? They became a problem. Sometimes they made me cry, even though none of it had happened. Then there was the part of me that just wanted to relive the firefight on Opie South. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but I wasn't going to lie. It felt good to be in the fight. It's funny how a part of me wished I had been more present, more alive in the moment. There's something exhilarating about being shot at without consequence. Winston Churchill had a point there. But that ambush on the street was different. Defending from a well-built defilade is about as good as it gets in a firefight, and being on the streets under fire? Not so much. It was important to keep things in perspective. But even in that chaos, there was a sense of relief, knowing you could at least hit back. Sure, there were a handful of us on the planet who could truly understand that feeling, but Joes didn't talk about those things. If you wanted to cry, you called home. The internet was up and running almost constantly, which was both a blessing and a curse. We weren't taking casualties anymore, and I could keep in touch with family more often, but that also meant home felt closer, almost too close. It made time drag even longer. Alana had set up a message board where we could leave messages for our families. It was the easiest way to stay connected, even if the communication was sporadic. I did the occasional phone call or instant message, but there were long stretches during January and February when I couldn't talk to anyone for weeks. And when we could talk, it was always brief. Those conversations got awkward, distant. A year is a long time, especially when you're 18 and you're not there to experience the world moving on without you. Alana was the only one I ever opened up to, so during those lonely guard shifts, I just kept it inside. I'd changed, I knew that much. But looking at it from her perspective, I'm sure it wasn't for the better. The days started feeling like they blended together. Same buildings, same roads, same faces. It was like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, just a never-ending loop of convoys and guard duty. The walls of the cop felt like a prison cell, and everything, the heat, the dust, the lack of sleep, began wearing me down. I escaped through books. Historical fiction about ancient Sparta helped me forget, just for a little while, what I was living through. I also started hitting the gym in earnest. Weightlifting was a new thing for me, something to do. I even tried to start this memoir, but the truth is, I wasn't ready for it yet. One night, while on gate guard, a stray dog approached and began growling at us. After several failed attempts to shoo it away, one of the Joes shot it with his M4. The shot didn't kill it. The dog ran off, but we could hear it howling in pain as it bled out. It was one of those moments that felt just wrong. The sergeant of the guard showed up, furious, both because of the dog's suffering and the lack of prior warning. He tore us apart for a minute before walking off. The rest of the night was silent except for the dog's cries. It was a miserable night, even for Ramadi. The convoys to Camp Ramadi and TQ became routine, mostly ferrying officers to and from staff meetings. We were doing so many of them that they blurred together. It felt like a game of chance with no real purpose, but I never questioned it. I had lost count of how many convoys we did, but it was enough to make me lose interest in the idea of them. As we neared the end of our deployment, the COP became quieter and quieter. The units that had been attached to us had long since left, and we were planning on turning the COP over to the Iraqis. Slowly, we transitioned from soldiers to laborers, clearing out buildings and shipping out equipment. Some days, we were guarding the locals we paid to do the work. It was a strange, inevitable shift. One day, Buford's mom reached out to me on social media. Someone from Dog Company had told her about a video of Buford on Facebook. She wanted to connect, share memories, and offer support. She invited me to Texas for the anniversary of his death. It hit me hard, especially when I realized how generous his family had been. They were a reminder of the spirit that had kept Buford going. Eventually, Battalion sent us a new platoon leader to restore some semblance of order. LT Hood was the former XO of Charlie Company, knowledgeable, professional, but not exactly thrilled to be here. He hated the fact that some of us smoked in the porta-potties. The Joes had always done it. The smell of smoke was the least offensive part of it. But LT Hood didn't think so, and he made us post armed sentries by the porta-potties. It was ridiculous, but I couldn't help but laugh. That was the kind of punishment that stuck with you. It was more effective than push-ups, that's for sure. I always respected creative punishments in the Army. Making someone wear a toe chain with license plates for forgetting their dog tags made a point. LT Hood didn't let up on us for too long, but it was a warning shot I won't forget. Soon after, SSG Carter became the new platoon sergeant, and that was the best news all deployment. Carter was the kind of guy who never hesitated to lead from the front. He had been right there with us in the thick of things, and we respected him for it. The months wore on. The roads to Camp Ramadi felt safer, even if the stretch to TQ still felt sketchy. But we had already crushed AQI in the city. We could let our guard down. I was starting to wonder how I was going to make it through the last few months without losing my mind. We were more than halfway through the deployment. The days were blending together. For more to go. The days dragged on, but we were closing in on the end of our deployment, and that brought both relief and dread. It was a strange mix. A year had felt like a lifetime. My body was numb to the exhaustion. The weight of my gear, the fatigue, the dust, it had all become a part of me. It was the kind of discomfort you forget you're feeling until you remove it. Like a long road trip where your back hurts, but you don't realize just how much until you step out of the car. We began to count the days. It was a small, childish thing we did to get through the hours, but the closer we got to the end, the harder it became. I was still waking up to the same stale air every morning, still pulling guard duty, still staring out into the same empty landscape. Sure, there were a few mission rehearsals here and there, and the occasional operational brief, but for the most part, the routine was set. We had reached a kind of limbo, but every time I thought I had gotten used to it, every time I convinced myself I had adapted, I would find a new layer of discomfort. A new ache. Sometimes it was in my shoulder from humping the M240B, sometimes it was in my head. The oddest part was that I wasn't sure which ache I hated more, the physical or the emotional. I hadn't realized how much I was holding back until I reached those last few weeks. That's when it started to catch up with me. The grief over Buford's death. The anger at Alana for leaving me at the worst possible time. The frustration at the Army and the way it chewed us up and spit us out without so much as a thank you. The real kicker, though, was the guilt. The nagging, ever-present guilt that followed me everywhere. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not anymore. I had already put in my time. I should have been home, living a life outside of this chaos. But instead, I was sitting in a guard tower at 2 a.m. in Ramadi, surrounded by nothing but silence and my own thoughts. On a rare moment of downtime, I found myself lying on my bunk, staring up at the netting draped over it. I had become a shell of who I thought I was. A version of myself I didn't even recognize. The carefree guy who showed up to boot camp all those years ago had been lost in a storm of combat, stress, and broken promises. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, but I knew I didn't like it. Garcia had given me a hard time when I started spending more time alone in my thoughts. He would poke his head in, make some joke, and try to drag me out of the pit I was in. Hey man, you're starting to make me look bad. Get your shit together. We've got a couple weeks left, and we're going to hit the ground running. It was his way of getting me to see the light. But it didn't work. I wasn't sure anything could. It wasn't just the war or the broken relationship, it was everything. The endless cycles of pain, loss, and confusion. The deeper I sank, the harder it felt to climb back out. I had no idea what I would return to. Would I go back to Colorado and fall into the same routine I had before? Would I be able to reintegrate into civilian life? Or would I go back to the army? The decision felt monumental. The weight of it pressed down on me every day, and I still hadn't found the answer. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of heat and dust, I sat with Kazinia by the landing zone. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air was cooling down slightly. We were sipping on a couple of warm beers Williams had managed to score. The taste was shit, but it was still beer. And in that moment, that small comfort felt like the best thing in the world. I don't know, man, I said, leaning back against the barrier. I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do with myself. Kazinia took a long swig of his beer and looked at me, his eyes narrowed in thought. What do you mean? I mean, everything. This whole thing. I've been here a year, I've got a few weeks left, and then what? Go home and pretend like it's all normal? Like nothing happened? I don't know what's real anymore, Kaz. He exhaled slowly, the weight of his words settling in the air between us. You know, I had the same fucking thoughts when I was coming up on my time. It's not easy, man. Hell, it's not supposed to be easy. You don't just come out of something like this and act like you didn't leave a part of yourself behind. I don't want to be that guy, I muttered. You know, the one who can't adjust. The one who's broken. You're not broken, Fletcher, Kazinia replied, his tone sharp. You've just been through shit. We all have. You think I came out of this the same guy I was when I went in? No fucking way. I leaned my head back and stared up at the sky. It was the first time in a long while I actually noticed the stars. They felt so far away, like they had nothing to do with the mess of life I had been dealing with. You know, I said after a long pause, I don't even know if I want to leave anymore. I can't go back to what I had. I mean, I'm not that guy anymore. Kazinia didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, understanding in his eyes. After a moment, he spoke. You don't have to be that guy, Fletcher. But you don't have to be this guy either. You've got options. You just need to take a step. The rest will follow. Whatever you decide to do, just know that you don't have to go it alone. It was strange how hearing those words, coming from him, felt like a lifeline. I wasn't sure if it was true or if he was just trying to comfort me. But at that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't entirely alone. The last few days of the deployment came quickly, and the squad started to joke more, the camaraderie resurfacing as we prepared for the end of our time in Ramadi. Some of the guys were already planning their post-deployment celebrations, the stories of wild nights out, bar hopping, and reckless behavior. They spoke of women and alcohol as if those were the only things worth looking forward to. I wasn't sure if I could relate to them anymore. My mind was still preoccupied with the uncertainty of what came next. I didn't know if I was ready to face a world that seemed so far removed from the one I had known for the past year. The final convoy to the airfield was surreal. The roads, once riddled with debris and danger, now felt like a path towards something unknown, something far scarier than anything I had faced in Iraq. We were going home, but I wasn't sure what home meant anymore. The security and certainty of this place had become my normal. The outside world felt like a distant memory, and I had no idea how I would fit into it again. As I loaded my gear onto the bus, I glanced around at my brothers. Some were already talking about their families and what they would do once they touched down. Others were quiet, the same as me, trying to come to terms with the end of this chapter. In the chaos of emotions, I realized something. I didn't need to have all the answers right away. I didn't need to figure out my entire future. I just needed to breathe, to take things one step at a time. When the plane finally took off from Ramadi, I looked out the window, feeling both a sense of relief and loss. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the world, but at least I had my brothers by my side. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The flight back felt like the world was closing in on me. The hum of the engines was the only sound that filled my ears, but even that felt distant. I leaned my head against the cold window, watching the desert below fade into the distance. The sand that had once felt like an endless, oppressive weight now seemed like a distant dream. I'd spent so much time in that endless stretch of nothingness that I couldn't help but wonder if this moment, this plane ride, was the beginning of a new kind of nothing. Around me, the guys were starting to relax, talking about what they'd do once they were back home. I heard a lot of talk about family, bars, fishing trips. Normal stuff. Stuff I was supposed to care about, but all of it felt so far away. What did that life even look like for me? What was I supposed to say when I saw my family again? How was I supposed to answer the questions about how I was holding up? I closed my eyes, trying to block out the noise. The last thing I wanted was to get caught in a conversation about things that weren't real to me. I didn't feel real anymore. It wasn't the war that had done it. It wasn't even the missions. It was the years of being someone else, the years of pretending I was okay, pretending I wasn't constantly watching my back. And now, after everything, the idea of stepping back into a life that seemed so innocent, so unaware of what I had seen, was terrifying. The plane's descent was smooth, but the moment we landed on the tarmac in Germany, I felt my chest tighten. We were in transit, not home yet, but the very fact that we were no longer in Iraq hit me like a ton of bricks. I half expected the plane's door to open and have someone shoot at us. But that was just the weight of it all. Every nerve in my body still screamed at me to be alert, to be ready. But I was no longer in the middle of a war zone. I was in a civilian airport. People walked around with their bags, talking casually without a care in the world. For a moment, I didn't know where I fit in. The next few days were a blur. The debriefings, the paperwork, the endless waiting in lines, it felt like everything was happening in some far-off world that I was only vaguely a part of. But there was one moment that stuck out, one conversation that I'll never forget. It was in the briefing room with Kazinia. He had a cigarette hanging from his lips, and he looked like he had just woken up. But despite his gruff exterior, there was a seriousness in his eyes that made me uneasy. "Fletcher," he said, tossing me a file. "We've been here a couple of days, but it's not over. You know that, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "The reintegration stuff. The counseling. They're going to ask you how you're doing, how you feel. It's bullshit. Don't let them fool you." I looked at him, confused. "What are you trying to say?" Kazinia leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "They don't care about you, man. They never did. They're going to run you through the motions, give you a few pamphlets about PTSD and adjusting to civilian life, and then you're gonna get shoved back into the world. Just like the rest of us." I was silent for a long time. I had never thought about it that way. The Army had always been about missions, getting in and getting out. They weren't interested in what happened afterward. They weren't interested in the fact that we were walking back into a world that was completely different, a world we had no idea how to navigate. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. What are we supposed to do then? Kazinia looked at me, his eyes hard and cold, as though he had already made peace with it. "You do what you have to. You fake it until you make it. Nobody cares if you're fucked up inside. They want you to show up, do your job, and pretend everything's fine. But we both know it's not." The weight of his words settled in my chest like lead. It was hard to admit it, but he was right. The Army's job was done. We were no longer valuable to them. Once we were home, we were just another set of broken bodies to be forgotten. And that thought, that truth, gnawed at me more than anything that had happened on the battlefield. When we finally touched down in the States, it wasn't like I thought it would be. No fanfare. No hero's welcome. Just another stop on the conveyor belt of reintegration. As soon as the plane doors opened, we were herded like cattle into the terminal. The civilians didn't even look at us. There were no handshakes, no smiles. Just people going about their day as though we didn't exist. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The constant hum of the airport, the background noise that never stopped, seemed louder than ever. But it wasn't the noise itself. It was the lack of urgency, the lack of fear. People were going about their lives without looking over their shoulders, and it made my skin crawl. I picked up my bag, feeling the weight of it, but not the weight of my past. My mind was a jumble of thoughts, but none of them seemed to fit together. I couldn't process any of it, not yet. It was all too much. Too fast. My parents were waiting for me at the gate. They were smiling, but I could see the concern in their eyes. The way they looked at me was the way people look at a stranger they don't know how to help. They had seen the changes, I knew that. They had read the reports, heard the stories. But seeing their son who had come back, was a different story. I approached them, trying to put on a smile, but it didn't feel real. "Hey, Mom, Dad," I said, my voice distant. They hugged me, but it felt like they were holding a ghost. "I'm glad you're home," my mom said, pulling back to look at me. "We're all so proud of you." I nodded. "Thanks." But as I stood there, with their arms around me, I realized something. I wasn't home. Not really. I was here, physically, but my mind was still far away. It was like the world had moved on, and I had been left behind. Later that night, after I had a long, quiet dinner with my family, I found myself sitting alone in my room. It was strange to be in my own bed again, the same bed I had slept in before all of this started. But it felt like a different world now. A world I couldn't step into. I thought back to the guys, the ones who didn't come home. I thought of Buford and the others, and I wondered if they would ever get to feel this kind of strange disconnection. Would they have felt like I did? Would they have struggled to find a place in this world again? I wanted to call someone. Anyone. But I didn't know who to turn to. No one could understand. No one could ever understand. The truth was, I was terrified. Not of the world, but of myself. I didn't know how to live in this world anymore, but I wasn't sure how to escape it either. Days passed, and the questions kept coming. How was I doing? What did I want to do next? What was I going to make of my life now? But the hardest question of all was the one I asked myself in the dark hours of the night when the world was silent and my thoughts were all that remained. Who the hell am I now? I had no answer. Not yet. But I was going to figure it out. One way or another. I had to. The days blurred together after that, one indistinguishable from the next. Each morning, I woke up to the same sterile light of my bedroom, the same familiar comfort of home that had never truly felt like mine. I would shower, eat, stare blankly at the walls, and pretend like I had some kind of control over what came next. But each passing day, the weight of it all grew heavier, like I was sinking into a place I could never escape. I had spent years in a war zone, surrounded by chaos and violence. There had been moments of clarity, fleeting and far between, when I knew what I was doing. Every mission, every choice, had a clear goal: survival, protection, completion. But here, in this civilian world, things didn't make sense. No one told you where to go or what to do. No one was handing you a weapon and telling you to fight for your life. And that was exactly the problem. Without the mission, without the clarity of purpose, I felt lost. The worst part? I couldn't talk to anyone about it. My parents, as much as I knew they wanted to help, couldn't understand. They couldn't see past the surface. I couldn't blame them. They hadn't seen what I had seen. They hadn't lost what I had lost. How could they possibly know? I spent my days pacing, trying to avoid the conversations I knew were coming. How's your mental health? What do you think about doing for a job? Are you getting enough sleep? Each question, each comment, was a reminder of how far removed I was from anything resembling normalcy. They didn't understand that I couldn't just turn off the things I'd experienced. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a few therapy sessions or a new hobby. I thought about calling up the guys from my unit, Kazinia, or maybe even Jensen, but the thought of talking to anyone felt like an emotional minefield. What could I possibly say? Hey, I'm back and everything is different? I didn't want to burden them with the same weight I was carrying. They were probably trying to make their own way in this strange new world, too. It was late one night when I finally broke. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the house settling around me. My mind was racing with a million thoughts, all disjointed and overwhelming. I kept thinking about the guys we'd lost, the faces I could still see so clearly in my mind. The guilt hit me hard, like a fist to the chest. Why had I made it out? Why was I still here while they were gone? I got up and grabbed the bottle of whiskey I had hidden in the back of the kitchen cabinet. I wasn't proud of it, but the numbness it provided was the only peace I could find. The first few sips burned, but after that, it was just a dull ache in the back of my throat. I didn't care. I didn't care about anything anymore. I drank for what felt like hours, trying to shut my mind off. But the more I drank, the louder the memories became. The sounds of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the constant sense of impending doom. They were there, in my head, and they weren't going anywhere. Eventually, I stumbled outside. The night air was cold, biting at my skin. I leaned against the porch railing, trying to steady myself. The quiet of the night was almost too much to bear. It was like the world had forgotten the chaos I'd lived through, and it made me feel even more disconnected. I wasn't sure how long I had been out there when I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel. I looked up, blinking in confusion. A car had pulled into the driveway. I didn't recognize it at first, but then the headlights flicked off, and I saw the silhouette of a man stepping out. Fletcher. It was Kazinia. I didn't know how he had found me. Maybe he had just been keeping tabs. Maybe he had been going through the same thing. But there he was, standing in my driveway in the middle of the night, looking at me like he had been expecting to find me here. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my voice hoarse, barely more than a rasp. "Checking in on you, man," he said, his voice low. "You look like you need someone to talk to." I laughed bitterly. "Talk to? About what? You think I'm going to unload all this on you?" He stepped forward, leaning against the railing next to me. "I'm not saying you have to talk, but you can't keep this shit bottled up, Fletcher. It'll eat you alive." I took another swig from the bottle, staring out into the darkness. The words hung heavy in the air, like something I couldn't avoid any longer. He was right. I couldn't keep ignoring it. But even if I wanted to talk, I wasn't sure I knew how. "Does it ever get better?" I asked, more to the night than to him. Kazinia was silent for a long time. "No," he said finally. "But you get used to it. You learn to keep going. You find something that keeps you moving forward. It's not about forgetting, man. It's about surviving it." I felt a knot in my stomach tighten at his words. Surviving it. That was the truth, wasn't it? No one really made it through without scars. Some of them just wore their scars better than others. I wanted to say something back, something deep or insightful, but the words didn't come. Instead, I just stood there, feeling the cold wind on my face, feeling the emptiness creeping in again. Kazinia stayed for a while longer, talking about the guys, about how they were all adjusting. Some had moved on to new jobs, others were still struggling to figure things out. He didn't mention what had happened to Buford or anyone else. He didn't have to. We both knew the truth. Some wounds couldn't be healed, no matter how much time had passed. Finally, he slapped me on the back. "I'm gonna head out, Fletcher. But you need to figure this shit out. You can't keep hiding from it." I watched him get back in his car and drive away, the headlights fading into the distance. It left me standing there in the dark again, the weight of his words sinking in. As the night wore on, I tried to make sense of everything. Maybe Kazinia was right. Maybe the key wasn't about finding peace, but about finding a way to live with the chaos. I had always been able to adapt before. Why should this be any different? But as I stood there, staring into the emptiness of the night, I realized that the hardest part wasn't figuring out how to live in this world. It was accepting that I might never fully belong to it again. And that realization, that raw truth, hit me harder than anything I'd faced on the battlefield. It wasn't just about surviving the war anymore. It was about surviving what came after.